The U.S. has been in some incredibly destructive wars in the past, but the current wars in the Middle East have been in the making since the beginning of the 20th century. The winning Western forces in World War I, namely Britain and France, created puppet countries in the Middle Eastern region and propped up vicious dictators in those new countries. There was much conflict in the region, and uprisings were constantly and brutally put down by both London and Paris. However, the U.S. began to take over in the region after World War II, mainly because it was the only developed country left intact by the war. What has followed has been a bloody century of Western suppression in the Middle East. Beginning in the 1950s, the U.S. encouraged terrorism in association with Islam. They supported this terrorism as a way to counter Soviet and Arab nationalist influences in the region. However, after the Cold War, the religious extremist terrorists began to be targeted by the U.S. government themselves, despite some still having strong ties to the West. The U.S., which had begun to influence the region more and more heavily since World War II, became the real puppet master in 1965 over disputes about the Suez Canal. The Egyptian president had moved to nationalize the Suez Canal, and Britain, France, and Israel threatened to invade Egypt to prevent the possible nationalization. However, the U.S. stopped the operation by denying Britain emergency oil supplies in the case of an invasion. This marked the final shift of regional influence from London and Paris to Washington, D.C. Despite the large amount of intervention in which the U.S. engaged in the 1950s, there was fairly little from the 60s to 80s. However, the U.S. did lend critical support to Israel in 1967 and 1973 in the Arab-Israel Wars. To the Arabs, this set a precedent of U.S. protection of Israel colonialism. However, the U.S. returned to the area with vengeance in the Gulf War of 1991. This war was a particularly acute humanitarian disaster, as the U.S. military committed such moral atrocities as burying Iraqi soldiers alive with bulldozers and shooting thousands of soldiers in the back as they were retreating along the so-called Highway of Death. Iraq was also crippled by a 12-year-long period of sanctions by the UN. These sanctions led to the death of an estimated 500,000 Iraqi children, as was even admitted by Madeleine Albright, the UN's ambassador. Those sanctions only ended after the 2003 invasion of Iraq by Anglo-American forces. This invasion was based upon false claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. The invasion was devastating to Iraq and led to later civil wars, which in turn fomented the creation of the Islamic State in Iraq, which later merged with terrorists in Syria to become ISIS. It is clear to any casual observer that the secular leaders of Iraq, Syria, and Libya were taken out because of their horrible human rights records, as is claimed. The evidence of this lies in the fact that Saudi Arabia and Israel also have horrendous human rights records, but these nations are propped up by the U.S. The Pentagon has been very wasteful of taxpayer dollars and has failed to audit itself, ever. The Pentagon's lack of accountability and its buying trends have warped the natural market incentives since the military-industrial complex really took off after World War II. As Professor Seymour Melman of Columbia University says succinctly, "Now that we have 6 tons of TNT per person in our strategic missiles and aircraft alone, have we become more secure than when they only had 1 ton of TNT per human being on Earth?" Tom Woods writes, quote, "The scale of the resources siphoned off from the civilian sector becomes more vivid in light of specific examples of military programs, equipment, and personnel. To train a single combat pilot, for instance, costs between $5 million and $7 million. Over a period of 2 years, the average U.S. motorist uses about as much fuel as a single F-16 training jet in less than an hour. The Abrams tank uses up 3.8 gallons of fuel in traveling 1 mile. Between 2 and 11% of the world's use of 14 important minerals, from copper to aluminum to zinc, is consumed by the military, as is about 6% of the world's consumption of petroleum. The Pentagon's energy use in a single year could power all U.S. mass transit systems for nearly 14 years. These problems can be accounted for in part by the American machine tools industry's relationship with the Defense Department. Once the Pentagon became the American machine tool industry's largest consumer, the industry felt far less pressure to hold prices down than it had in the past. That decreased pressure undoubtedly contributed to the negligible investment by the machine tool industry in modern production techniques of a kind used routinely in Europe. No longer under traditional market pressure to innovate and lower cost, the machine tool industry saw a considerable drop in productivity. By 1967, America imported more machine tools than it exported. Another way to shine light on the problem is to compare the U.S.'s military spending with the numbers of similar countries around the world. The American government's military expenditure equals the sum of all the military spending that the rest of the world does. Part of the problem is that the Defense Department is the only federal agency not subject to audit. Congress gave the Department of Defense a special pass from accountability in the 1990s. This means that accountants have no idea where the Department of Defense's money goes, and it is common for the Pentagon not to know where contractors have been paid once, twice, or not at all. It doesn't even know who or how many contractors there are. Tom Woods says that, quote, to tabulate the full amount of government expenditure on defense, it is not enough to glance at the budget for the Department of Defense. That number was $518.3 billion in 2009 and excludes hundreds of billions of dollars in additional defense-related expenditure. Economist Robert Higgs suggests that the real defense budget is closer to $1 trillion. Mainly because of its lack of accountability, the Pentagon has had an incredible history of inefficiency and taxpayer dollars wasted. Despite tens of billions being wasted on a project like the F-35, examples tend to draw the most attention from the media, and the most outrage among taxpayers involve overspending on routine items. This may be because the average person doesn't have a sense for what a fighter plane should cost, but can more easily grasp that spending $640 for a toilet seat or $7,600 for a coffee pot is outrageous. These kinds of examples, first exposed through work done in the 1980s by Dina Razor of the Project on Military Procurement, undermine the position taken by President Ronald Reagan's administration that not a penny could be cut from its then-record peacetime Pentagon budgets.
War can be the epitome of immorality. It is usually the purposeful killing of people, some of whom are innocent and don't want to be involved, and this can be for the purposes of keeping one person or party in power. It can come down to the exploitation of many for the good of a few. War also wounds everyone involved. This includes the soldiers who get drafted and then injured or killed, the soldiers' families, and the innocent people that war kills, injures, or destroys the life of. No one ever comes back from a war unharmed, whether the wounds come in the form of physical wounds, such as lost limbs or other body parts, or mental trauma, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or even both. PTSD is an especially haunting disorder, as it is mentally debilitating for many veterans. There are stories of veterans who cannot hear loud sounds or see specific images or people without being traumatically thrown back to their memories and having fits of rage when seeing reminders of their mental stress. The families of soldiers overseas oftentimes experience extreme stress. Not only can they not enjoy the company of their loved ones, but they're never sure whether or not they'll ever see them again at all, or in one piece. This kind of daily, weighted stress can be utterly unbearable for some. Perhaps the most adversely affected by war are those whose homeland is being attacked. They live in constant fear for their lives, and everyone is subject to the horrors of war. They did nothing to deserve any of the death and destruction headed their way, but they are being punished regardless, for someone else's misdeeds or assumptions. Many times soldiers in other countries bring with them equipment that can cause numerous medical problems for the current generations and the ones yet to come. This leads to mass newborn deformation and other equally heartbreaking disorders. This is possibly one of the most horrific elements of war. War, in most cases, can be completely unnecessary, or at least very hard to justify. Therefore, many terrible things happen to people without a true need in order to create peace or get something accomplished. The more war we have, the further away we grow from a world where no one is forced to kill another, or a world where there is more peace than pain. So what can we do to help? Although, individually, we cannot rid the world of war or pain, we can take tiny steps in the right direction. An important thing is to be open and loud about the problem with war. This could be in a large form, such as a protest, or even the smallest form, such as being a kind and understanding person. A big component of that is thinking through everything, gathering facts or evidence, and always trying to understand the other point of view before making assumptions, especially if you're a person with some sort of position of power. Another step, if you're 18 or older, would be to vote against giving the military more money and voting against politicians who are in favor of war. As long as many people are taking small steps, there's potential for peace in this world.
There I stood in the night, out on the broken pier, me with my feet in the sea, you with your face in the clouds, the man in the moon. And as I heard your voice, felt your laugh flood across the broken pier, I down across the waves, as if to say to me, everything will be okay. Be strong and true. And I felt your eyes like a tide pulling me out into the air. For a moment in time, you held me there. And I felt your eyes